The U.S. and China are reaching a trade deal. President Trump and Xi Jinping agreeing to extend a tariff truce and roll back export controls. Edward Fishman of Columbia University and author of Chokepoints joins us now. Eddie, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to see you, too.
So what was your initial take on this deal or this agreement or this discussion between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump?
Sure. So look, in a sense, we're sort of back to where we started. Trump came out right after he was inaugurated in January with these massive tariffs on China. First the fentanyl tariffs, then eventually the reciprocal tariffs. And basically ever since then, it's just been an effort by the Trump administration to walk those back without appearing to lose to Xi Jinping. To me, the big sort of strategic impact right now is that China has shown the world that its control over rare earth minerals has the United States over a barrel. And what that means is it just dramatically decreases the U.S. influence over China, whether that's on artificial intelligence or even on Russia, where, is Trump actually going to pressure Xi Jinping over Russia? I'm skeptical.
Well, but do you think that this actually pushes the United States to have closer ties with other countries that are dealing with the same issue? It wasn't just the United States. It was also Europe that really was alarmed by these rare earth exports because they were hit just as much as the United States. How much does this sort of expedite this push for the rest of the world to create some barrier between themselves and their reliance on Chinese products?
So that is actually how, if Trump is going to turn this into a win, it's going to be building what some people have called allied scale, coming together with the Europeans, with allies in the Asia Pacific to actually build alternatives to Chinese supply chains. Rare earths obviously would be a great place to start. What I'd say is if you look at Trump's first term, probably the biggest success of his first term was Operation Warp Speed, where rapidly they developed these vaccines that really helped us get out of the COVID pandemic. We need something like that today with rare earths. The thing is, though, we're never going to be able to do that totally domestically, just at home. We're going to need to work with allies for us to fix this problem in any reasonable amount of time.
But is there any appetite for Europe to do that, especially given the fact that they have a ton of climate initiatives, and this is a very dirty industry?
Yeah, look, I agree with you. At the same time, I think that despite those concerns with climate, and I was just in Europe a couple of weeks ago, there's a significant concern right now that China basically, again, has veto power over any policy we want, right? Even Taiwan, right? Thank God that didn't come up, apparently, in the conversation yesterday. But there's real fear that American deterrence vis-a-vis China over Taiwan has dramatically decreased because China has shown that it can shut down Ford factories in the matter of weeks if it cuts off our access to rare earths. The thing I'd say, by the way, the U.S. has similar power over the dollar. We just haven't been using that against China. We've been using tariffs, which are a significantly weaker weapon.
Well, what would your suggestion be to the administration to use the dollar?
Financial sanctions, right? So
secondary sanctions on banks if they buy Russian oil, things like that?
Sure. So certainly when it comes to Russia, the key is applying pressure to China, India, et cetera, to tell them that if they keep buying oil from Russia, their banks, their refineries are going to be cut off from the dollar. But even vis-a-vis China, I think Trump's biggest mistake was coming in and assuming that because the U.S. runs a trade deficit with China, the fact that we import more from China than China imports from us, that we would always win a trade war because we could always impose more tariffs on China than they can impose on us. What he didn't anticipate was asymmetric retaliation, that China wouldn't necessarily retaliate just with its own tariffs, but it would do export controls and rare earths. Well, you know what? The biggest choke point in the global economy isn't rare earths. It's the dollar, which is still used in 90% of foreign exchange transactions. And even for China, 70% of its own trade is settled in dollars.
But, Ed, that would be the nuclear step, because that can also have mass implications on the United States and our stock market.
Look, I'm not saying that you would cut off every single Chinese bank from the dollar, but I think if the goal is to establish some level of deterrence with China, to show that we can escalate as well, the area to go is financial sanctions. I mean, if you look at big Chinese companies like Huawei, it's actually remarkable that they aren't under sanctions, right? I mean, we've done a lot to try to cripple Huawei's access to a lot of things, but we haven't put them under sanctions.
But, Eddie, we have seen sanctions placed recently on Lufthansa and Rosneft going in Russia and going directly after some of the biggest oil giants in the region. Do you expect that to be successful? Is that sort of a template of what could be used to come?
Yeah, this is something that I hope, because if you look at Trump's strategy even on India, right, if you go back to August, he wanted India to cut its purchases of Russian oil. So he came out with these massive 50% tariffs on India in August and said, please cut your purchases of Russian oil. Well, the data speaks for itself. In September and October, India increased its purchases of Russian oil. And it's because, again, tariffs are not a significant geoeconomic weapon. India's exports to the U.S. fell in those 2 months, but its overall exports actually rose because it can just sell stuff to other countries, right? But what's happened in the wake of the sanctions last week is we've already seen refineries like Reliance in India and big Chinese oil companies recalibrate their purchases of Russian oil. So I do think you'll see some dip in Russian oil sales in the coming months. Whether it's a durable effect, though, is going to depend on Trump actually pressuring Xi Jinping and Modi and telling them that, look, if you keep doing this, there actually will be consequences for your companies.
You know, it's really interesting to think about it through your lens, through the choke points. We saw the choke point that's rare earth minerals. We've seen the choke point that is energy, especially now with the AI build out, and the choke point that is the dollar. And I want to stay on the dollar, this question of how much what happened in 2022 with some of the sanctions on Russia and this question of seizing assets that were dollar denominated caused a flight from the dollar to eliminate that choke point for other countries. How realistic do you see that flight away from the dollar? Because everyone wants to get away from these choke points and get a little bit more leverage in a world that seems to be controlled increasingly by the people who control these choke points.
I think that's really well said. Basically, if I'm trying to, at a macro level, what's happening in the global economy today, economic warfare is everywhere. When the U.S. weaponizes the dollar, it makes other countries feel vulnerable. They try to insulate themselves. When China weaponizes rare earths, it makes us feel vulnerable. We invest in MP materials and buy, 15% equity in them. So, yes, there has been efforts by China and Russia, et cetera, to diversify away from the dollar. So far, the data doesn't really show that those are succeeding particularly well. To me, the biggest risk isn't so much China and Russia. They're always going to be nervous about the dollar. Is Europe concerned about the dollar? Is Japan concerned about the dollar? I think earlier this year, when Trump started imposing economic warfare not just on China and Russia, but against Europe, against Japan, you did start seeing even our friends start saying, wait, we need to sort of diversify. If that is a threat that is ongoing, if our allies in Europe are just as worried about U.S. sanctions as they are about Chinese export controls, then yes, there will be a flight away from the dollar.
Well, you just were in Europe. Whose side are they on?
The Europeans are clearly on America's side. I mean, the Europeans want the United States to be there for them, their ally vis-a-vis Ukraine, and they want there to be the U.S. to be their ally vis-a-vis China. The Europeans are terrified of Chinese overcapacity, too. Look at the European auto industry.
They're not doing anything about it.
On China or Russia? Which one?
On China.
Look, I would agree with you that they haven't.
On Russia.
Yeah,
They
well,
were late to
Russia.
the
So
game.
Russia, because this, I'm glad you brought this up, because on Russia, there's been this narrative from the Trump administration that the Europeans haven't been doing anything on Russia sanctions. Come on. They imposed secondary sanctions on Indian refineries and Chinese banks in July and again last week. So the stuff that in the U.S. we're saying, wait, what, is Trump going to sanction China or India? Europe is doing that. I mean, and actually, they have now drawn China's ire because they've been sanctioning Chinese banks.
Eddie Fishman of Columbia University, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate your thoughts. Always deeply thoughtful.